So I want to thank Kellogg in its entirety, but especially its staff, for constructing this event and its leadership. This is great. I'm delighted to be part of this event, and it will be, the hope is to be an annual conference, and given Kellogg's history and reputation in the study of democracy especially, and human development, this is the right event for Kellogg to have, and it's a great to start it off with such an august set of speakers, experts, and yeomanry, citizens out there, the rest of us. I'm Clark Gibson. I was an undergraduate here about the same time the log cabin was built, I think. So it's great they asked me to help out. I'm a professor of political science at UC San Diego. I'm on the board here at Kellogg. These are topics that are near and dear to my heart, have been for decades. So it's great to be part of this panel. Now, this panel is about the relationship between development and democracy. That's a very old idea, and academics and policymakers are more sophisticated than they used to be about this relationship, which we will hear. And now I don't want to be, biased towards my panel, but we are actually we have a great panel. We have a great panel because we have a tremendous mix of policymakers and academics, which was the point of the conference, is to bring both of those worlds together. And really the kind of the cutting edge of research and some of the cutting edge of policymaking, I think. I'm going to introduce them first before they all speak. So Michael Camilleri on the end here is currently an assistant administrator at USAID. So he works directly with Administrator Powers at AID. Before his current, he heads the Bureau of Latin America and the Caribbean, and he wasn't given that job because he has no experience. Before this job, he has been part of the Secretary of State's staff in the NSC in the Andean area. He's cut his teeth actually helping civil society groups in Guatemala before he became part of the government. He has an undergraduate degree from this august institution, and then he had to go to Harvard for his law degree, unfortunately, but so he has tremendous experience. He's going to be talking about an AID democracy initiative. So he's right in the thick of democracy and policy making, and can there be policy initiatives to help foment somehow, where they say in health delivery, partner with other institutions and countries for the pursuit of something we call democracy. So Helena Hofbauer Balmori is Ford Foundation. So this is our other fantastic, very well experienced policymaker. So she is the Director of Civic Engagement and Government for the Latin American region. She has a really interesting background. Before then, she was a director of an NGO that I didn't know until I looked at her CV, the International Budget Partnership. It's a very interesting movement to make budgets transparent around the world. Really interesting work. And then she cut her teeth by actually creating her own center of research on social and government issues in Mexico before she became the powerful person she is now. So these are two veteran policymakers. I know they look like they're young and in their 20s, but they're really have amazing levels of experience in all levels of policymaking. And if we go, and they're going to talk, and their remarks are going to overlap, and you'll see why. I won't tell you what their talks are. So we have two academics as well. So Evelyne Huber is she has actually a true, by the way, Helena has a master's degree from Notre Dame, so 6 degrees of separation. Less. Evelyne is technically the Moorhead Alumni Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. But I wanted to say the distinguished part of that title is actually true. She is a very distinguished professor in political science, especially Latin America, democracy, parties. She's long been a strong voice in the literature and at meetings. So we're lucky to have her here on this panel. And James Long, who comes from the University of Washington, Seattle, is known for really innovative techniques about observing and detecting and actually reducing electoral fraud in elections around the world. Amazing experiences from Afghanistan to Kenya and Uganda and South Africa, really high-level techniques, randomized controlled trials, digital technologies in pursuing kind of this democratic institution building, maintaining. And what's interesting about their presentations is they're both going to be kind of moving into it's not just what you elect, but it's what those governments do for democracy and development and the future and health of democracy. Is what are these governments doing after they get elected? So I wanted to start with that set of introductions. That's why we have this great panel. And we'll start with Michael. Can we start with you?
Here, or if you want me
it's up to you. Maybe you go up. Okay. Thanks.
I do as I'm told here, Clark, on your panel, so
Power.
thank you for
Speaking
the,
of authoritarianism.
yeah. Can you all hear me okay? All right, great. Thanks, Clark, for the introduction. Thank you, Anibal, to you and your amazing team for bringing us together for these important conversations. It's really a privilege to be here. I'm honored to be representing USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. We like to brag that USAID is the world's premier international development agency, as well as the world's leading provider of democracy assistance. But when it comes to democracies, there's not been a whole lot to brag about lately. Our Secretary Blinken, likes to joke that events about the future of democracy sometimes feel like a funeral for democracy. So I'm going to try to inject some optimism maybe into our conversations. But maybe the frame should be the recognition that I know has been present in a lot of the conversations of the kind of sobering democratic trajectory of the last couple of decades, which calls on all of us really to critically examine and re-examine our efforts, and that of course includes those of us at USAID. So I'm going to use this initial time just to share some of our new ideas, and I embrace that framing for this discussion, particularly as it pertains to this intersection between democracy and development. It is that very connection between democracy and development which explains why USAID as a development agency is so deeply invested in strengthening democracy in the first place. We know that democracy and democratic political systems, however imperfect and messy they are the best way to achieve peace, prosperity, and sustainable development. Now, I'm not going to presume to lecture to a room full of democracy scholars about the research supporting this claim, but needless to say, we do have strong evidence, much of it derived from sources like VDEM, that democracies are better for economic development. They are less likely to experience economic crises and superior at delivering public goods and services. So for an international development agency like USAID, these are pretty powerful insights. They buttress the kind of intrinsic case for democracy with a robust instrumental case. They belie the authoritarian narrative that top-down command and control autocratic systems are more efficient at delivering for citizens, and they demonstrate that democracy and sustainable development are integrally linked. So, the kind of obvious question that follows is, if more democracy means more development, what do we do about that? And as I mentioned, support for democracy, human rights, governance, these are not new issues at USAID, but in the past couple of years, we've taken steps to deepen and to some degree rethink our democracy work. And maybe most notably, we're doing that by examining how all of our development work can support democracy, rights, and governance outcomes in a couple of ways that are pretty fundamental and that I'd like to discuss. The first, and I'll touch on this briefly before turning to the second one, but the first is to say that we're looking at all of our development assistance, whether that's health or climate change or economic growth, and asking how can we design those programs in ways that facilitate democratic progress in a country. So we're asking all of our missions around the world to look at their entire assistance portfolio, so not just their democracy programming, and ask how can it contribute to democratic development by explicitly and deliberately considering democratic principles and practices in program design and implementation. The second thing, and I'll spend more time here, is that we're regarding all of our economic programming as a form of democracy assistance to the extent that it respects democratic norms. And so when we help democratic leaders inclusively and accountably address key development needs, whether that's bringing down inflation or lowering food prices or reopening a market after a natural disaster, we're demonstrating in a way that a free press or a vibrant civil society can't always do that democracy is delivering. The president of Zambia, President Hichilema, published an op-ed in the Washington Post a couple of years ago with the title, "You Cannot Eat Democracy," right, which is a kind of a pithy way of capturing this idea. So this conviction that democracy succeeds not just by protecting fundamental freedoms, but by making people's everyday lives better, led USAID Administrator Samantha Power to conceive and launch what became our Democracy Delivers initiative, which I had the privilege of leading until recently. And this is one way of both kind of recognizing and now operationalizing this nexus between democracy and development. And so to give you maybe a sense of what inspired this in practice, consider a couple of countries. And no prizes for guessing here which countries these are, but first country, an authoritarian leader comes to power in a coup d'etat, rules by force for 23 years, citizens inspired by an act of defiance by a simple fruit vendor, outraged by corruption and economic stagnation, rise up in mass, overthrow the dictator, trigger similar revolutions in neighboring countries. The country transitions to democracy, it holds free and fair elections, it expands protections of human rights. But under democratic rule, economic growth slows, the national debt balloons, unemployment rises to 18%. Economic crisis and a global pandemic provide the pretext for a populist president to again consolidate power. And a decade after overthrowing dictatorial rule, the country's democratic experiment hangs in the balance. Now consider a second country. This country's been battling corruption since independence from the Soviet Union 30 years ago. In the same country, Russia-aligned oligarchs masterminded the theft of 12% of the country's GDP from its banks. People took to the streets a few years later, demanding accountability and justice for the complicit. A new president was elected as a result of this uprising, pledging a democratic European future for her country. She took on the oligarchs. She stood up to Russian aggression in Ukraine and suffered the consequences. Russia cut off energy supplies and imports of key products vital for the country's economy. Economic growth suffered. Citizens' energy bills multiplied. The president even denounced a Russian-backed coup plot. But with support from USAID, the broader US government, and our European partners, her government quickly identified alternative energy sources, opened new markets for its agricultural commodities, and today the country is largely independent of Russian gas, an official candidate for EU membership, and the leading plum exporter in the Northern Hemisphere. So again, no prizes for guessing the first country, which is of course Tunisia. Any guesses on the second? Moldova. So now these descriptions are necessarily simplified. I'm sure there's plenty of folks in the room who would quibble with some of these details. But I think the broader point is to illustrate vividly the challenge that inspired this Democracy Delivers initiative, which is that when democratic reformers come to power, unless they quickly solidify their democratic and economic gains, populations understandably grow impatient, especially if they feel like the risks that they took to upend the old order have not yielded reforms that are positively impacting their own lives. And such discontent can allow the opponents of democratic rule, often aided nowadays by external autocratic regimes, to wrest back control, reverse reforms, and snuff out dreams of rights-respecting self-government. So what we try to do with the Democracy Delivers initiative is kind of tilt things back in the other direction, surging support, resources, attention to countries at precisely that moment when the stakes are highest, when they're experiencing a promising but fragile moment of democratic opportunity. And nowhere really is that task more urgent than in societies that have managed to elect democratic reformers or throw off autocratic or anti-democratic rule through peaceful protests or successful political movements. So we hear a lot, perhaps too much, about democratic backsliding and declining global freedom. That is a challenge that we must tackle, that we are tackling. But it can't come at the expense of losing sight of the places where good things are happening, the so-called bright spots, where citizen activism or a twist of fate has created an opening for a more democratic future. So with Democracy Delivers, we're harnessing the resources and relationships of USAID to help reformers in these bright spots deliver with agility, with transparency, with visibility on citizen priorities. And I'll give you an example of how we're doing this. Guatemala came up a little bit this morning in our excellent discussion on Latin America. It came up a lot at dinner last night as well. I know many in this room are following with keen interest the situation there. President Arevalo has been in the office for a little bit more than 100 days. He rode, of course, this wave of popular rejection to the corrupt regime that came before, surging from I think, Baco, you said, was it even in the polls, let alone, not even, polling literally at like 0% or something close to it, to then win a landslide victory in the second round. But now, of course, comes the hard part, which is delivering on the promises that he made, particularly to the long ignored and long deprived indigenous communities that were so critical to not just his electoral victory, but then sustaining that victory through the very tough months of transition. And of course, delivering in the face of sustained opposition and entrenched interests that are determined to undermine him at every turn. And so this is precisely the kind of inspiring but inherently fragile democratic opening that we need to mobilize behind. And so at USAID, we have quickly surged additional resources to provide the Arevalo administration policy and planning support, technical assistance to half a dozen ministries, work with the health authorities to quickly improve the visibility of medicines and supplies, to design a rural credit program, to stand up an investment promotion authority, to support the government's community dialogues in Ixil, in Quiché, in Huehuetenango. But when I say that we need to mobilize behind these democratic bright spots, I don't mean just the USAID or the broader U.S. government or even governments alone. We literally can't do this alone. And so there's a big emphasis in this approach on partnerships with business, with philanthropies, with other bilateral and multilateral donors. I'm very pleased to be sharing this panel with Helena, who has really spearheaded from the Ford Foundation one of our most impactful partnerships. Together with Ford and in their very beautiful space in New York around the corner from UN headquarters, we convened on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly the leaders from all our Democracy Delivers countries and a dozen or so philanthropies, and actually mobilized over $100 million last fall in philanthropic support, together with $145 million in U.S. government support for Democracy Delivers countries and objectives. So we think we're onto something here. This initiative is less than 2 years old. We're moving fast. We're learning as we go. We're asking lots of questions. How long do democratic openings last? What makes them most likely to succeed? What kinds of support are most effective and on what timeline? Now, since we're here at this Institute of Higher Learning, I would invite the academics in the room to help us tackle these questions. This is very much a work in progress, but we are convinced that as we update our democratic playbook for a world in which democracy is not just under threat, but often under attack, that it is essential we really develop this toolkit of surging support quickly and impactfully to democratic bright spots when and wherever they emerge. Democracy Delivers is one way in which we are responding to President Biden's call for democratic renewal, breaking down the barriers between development assistance and democracy assistance, and acting on the strong body of evidence that expanding democracy globally will advance human dignity and accelerate our development impact. And we, of course, welcome all of you in this effort. Hopefully, Clark complied with your time limits and
Beautiful.
other instructions.
Well
all right.
Great.
Thanks
you.
a lot.
That's great. Helena?
Thank you very much. Buenos días a todos. I have many reasons to be thankful for being here, and one of them is that this is one of my alma maters. So I am really happy to being here after having been here more than 20 years ago to study a master's in peace at the Kroc Institute. And if you're trying to figure what that means, it means that after primary school, I went to a master's at Notre Dame, and that is how time makes sense. Then I'm also grateful because Aníbal, thank you for inviting me for this particular conversation with this distinguished panel in this distinguished conference. And I'm also grateful to Clark, who, with one simple comment, made me a policymaker, which I have never been in my life. I have always considered myself to be an activist. And at this moment, I'm being an activist from the Ford Foundation, which is a peculiar role to play because I'm on sometimes what looks like the other side of the table for civil society. But it has given me a wonderful opportunity to interact with a lot of people and to think about how to tackle some of the problems of our time. Ford has been committed since always to democracy and to the ideals and the principles of democracy. And over the last 9 years, our main focus has been on inequality. And we came to inequality as an issue that is not about poverty, but it is about how opportunities and goods and life is distributed between power and not power. And as such, working on inequality has made us focus on issues that are related with race, with violence, with gender, with ethnic justice, issues that are related with tech and society and how it impacts equalizing or not so much our societies, issues that have to do with the future of workers, and my own program, which is civic engagement and governments. And when we think about civic engagement and governments, what we're most interested in is how to make sure that there is enough space for citizens to hold governments to accountable and to be able to influence governments in the issues that affect them most. Internationally, at regional level, this has translated into working on very concrete issues. Impunity in Mexico and Central America, which is a region that I also direct, violence in Brazil, corruption in East Africa. But at the international level, civic engagement in governments has meant how to think about civic space and the importance of maintaining civic space in order to be able to establish that relationship between governments and citizens. And civic space happens to be an essential element of democracy. It happens to be something that without which talking about democracy becomes tricky. So I will try to string together a series of ideas. I will not go into data because you all have more data than what I could ever come up with. And that is not what I want to do or what I could be doing. So we know that democracy has been stumbling because of a series of challenges that are related with inequality, opportunities for everyone, and escalating violence. Inequality was negatively affected by the pandemic. Escalating violence is being spurred by a series of factors, and overall, democracy is reflecting a series of retrogressions indicated in VDEM and many other indexes. Although after yesterday, I'm not sure that I have been reading the indexes correctly. So these challenges that are undermining democracy are also undermining other key democratic institutions. And that is what I want to focus on more. We have heard a lot about social media already, and the social media revolution made it possible for everybody to play a role in distributing information. That is democratization of media. Nevertheless, it has actually played the role of undermining traditional media, and therefore undermining the role of traditional media as a means of accountability, and has played a crucial role in the endless generation of post-truth, mis- and disinformation. And the proliferation of misinformation is having profound implications for democracy by transferring trust from institutions to often mercurial personalities that are using the power that social media transfers to their narrative to destabilize and undermine democracy. We have already heard about algorithmic amplification and echo chambers, which were very much mentioned in the last panel, and the role that they play in providing fertile ground for the dissemination of very simplistic messages, which is ultimately not what democracy is about, or what we thought that democracy would be about. Another key element that has been undermined by these trends is civil society, which we consider to be a key pillar of democracy, for holding governments to account and for pushing for solutions that include those who are not necessarily on the agenda of governments. NGOs, CSOs, CBOs have seen their room for action consistently diminished over the last decades. The global pattern of increasing legal restrictions and harassment faced by civil society limits their ability to operate from Asia to Africa to Latin America and to the US. I know that the US feels this for the first time acutely after the presidency previous to this one, but it can get much worse, definitely. The erosion of civic space is compounded by targeted attacks on social justice leaders. If we look at the numbers that are put together by Amnesty International, Frontline Defenders, Global Witness, and many other organizations, the criminalization, intimidation, violence, and the killings of social justice leaders has been on the rise for more than a decade. Every year, the number of killings of social justice leaders is higher. That means that in reality, key players of democratic space and democratic conversations and negotiations are under fire every single day. At the same time, the toolbox that civil society developed, and to which foundations like mine contributed substantively, has been rendered ineffective. International accountability mechanisms have lost power. Strategic litigation has been weaponized against social justice agendas. And public media campaigns or evidence-based advocacy are toothless in a whirlwind of social media misinformation, disinformation, and alternative truths. Now, what is important is the combination of these factors. When you think about the rise of inequality, the weakening of media, the harassment of civil society, and therefore the closing of space for dissent, for opposition, for alternative ideas, this combination has led to toxic polarization. And toxic polarization, with the rise of inequality, has given room to leaders that actually spin this toxic polarization for their own benefit and vision. It has paved the way towards populisms, and these populisms have a clear inclination towards authoritarian tendencies. We don't have to talk anymore about Bukele and AMLO and Milei and others out there. They have already been mentioned. And these leaders, this was also said in the previous panel, have an inclination for anti-system regimes. And these anti-system regimes lean into their population's beliefs about their societies being broken, their country being in decline, and their economy being rigged in favor of the rich. There is this one study that I have not heard mentioned over these days in the many indexes that have been discussed, which is the Ipsos Populism Survey, which in 2024 looks at some of the main countries that will have elections during this year. And if you look at that survey, you will see that there is one country which consistently is faring better than 6 years ago. That is Mexico. Because during the populist government of López Obrador, Mexico has actually closed some of the gaps of discontent, because the toxic polarization, the undermining of the media, and the attacks on journalists and on activists, and for that case, on any kind of opposition, is playing a role. So I know that it is important for us to think with experts and to talk with experts about what democracy is actually facing, but it's also important for us to don't lose sight of what people are facing in these countries and how people are organizing or not, understanding or not, and playing within these dynamics or not. So what can we do? We are thinking constantly as a foundation, what can we do and how we can support different ways. Oh my God, I'm overall powerful. The earth is shifting. What we can do and how we can support innovative thoughts, innovative action, and innovative ways of approaching these problems. So I want to put a couple of ideas on the table. Unlike previous work on democracy, which assumed that we are all on the same page of what democracy is and what is most relevant in a democracy, we need to start having a much more nuanced and regionally grounded conversation on reimagining democracy. Democracy cannot be determined only in the global north. And I'm saying this very aware of how white all of these panels have been. Even though I am Latina, I am still white, and how little voices from the global south beyond Latin America have been present. We must convey actors from the global south and north to work on a new theory of democracy if we want to transcend the idea of democracy being a colonial Western project. In Africa, the resistance and the disenchantment with democracy has a lot to do with how colonial democracy is perceived. Related to this is the need to work on public discourse and to strengthen the resilience of the information ecosystem, support for independent media, greater transparency from social media companies, digital literacy, and robust fact-checking mechanisms are essential. We're fighting for them in the policy debates at the global level, and in Europe and in very concrete specific niches. But more has to be done beyond the policy level. We need to focus on how citizens engage with their governments and public institutions in between elections. Democracy understood as fair, free, and periodic elections is insufficient to turn the current tide. Inequality, impunity, the rule of law are essential elements of how we have to understand democracy. If we see democracy only as the structures, it is not enough. Some of the work that was mentioned yesterday about deliberative democracy and AI is a good example of breaking some of these barriers. Last, while authoritarian forces count on robust international spaces and structures to inform their efforts and foster peer support, there is still a major gap among those on the front lines of defending democracy, and there is a gap in solidarity networks. We must support learning and action hubs for democracy so as to deploy good strategy, stand up effective efforts, innovate, be resilient, and succeed over time. For this, transcending the silos in which we operate is essential. Academic institutions, civil society, media, government, philanthropies. We have to break down these silos and understand that if we're not in this together, we're going to lose. Because the opposition, the other side, they are together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helena. Evelyne is now on the clock.
All right. I'm going to inflict a PowerPoint on you, but I'm a visual learner, so I do appreciate them, and I hope some of you do too. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here and contribute to our collective reflections on the conditions that support or endanger democracy. Now, the questions that were posed for this session are first, whether state failure to promote human development combined with growing inequality is at the root of the current crisis of democracy. And I would answer in the affirmative, but argue that the process is an indirect one, working through relative deprivation and the decline of political parties, and I shall explain. The second question has to do with timing. If structural conditions change slowly, why have we seen a concurrent proliferation of populist leaders worldwide? To this, I would answer that structural conditions do change slowly, but cyclical fluctuations may lead to a deterioration of living conditions that are perceived much more rapidly. Also, slow change may build up over time until it reaches a critical threshold and its effects become visible. So I shall base my remarks on the Latin American experience, but actually we have seen surprisingly similar developments in post-industrial democracies, and I shall be happy to talk about those in the discussion. Now, let me preface my remarks with the acknowledgement that, of course, there is no one-factor explanation. The security threats that we heard about in the last panel are real, but I'm going to talk about dynamics that make it more difficult to deal with these threats and others in an effective manner. All right. If we are talking about democracy in Latin America, we have to start with the foundational work of Kellogg faculty. These scholars have written widely on the congenital defects of democracy in Latin America at the beginning of the third wave, a context of very high social and economic inequality and a scarcity of institutionalized party systems. Guillermo O'Donnell, in his important contribution to the 2004 UNDP report on the state of democracy in Latin America, argued that if we see democracy as a regime built on the principle of citizenship that includes civil, political, and social rights, we have to presume that citizens have the capacity for autonomous decision-making to exercise these rights, and this is hardly the case in situations of extremely high inequality like those in Latin America. Now, the links between citizens and the state where decisions are taken that are crucial for the collective, are provided by political parties. Indeed, a basic assumption of political scientists has been that democracy in mass societies is unthinkable without political parties. But Scott Mainwaring and Tim Scully, in their path-breaking work on parties and party systems in Latin America, showed just how few countries had stable party systems and parties firmly anchored in civil society. Now, if we look at the dynamics in Latin America over the past half century, we have to recognize that the relationship between human development, inequality, and democracy has not been direct and linear. In the period before 2000, during the debt crisis and the period of structural adjustment, human development was lower than now, and inequality rose to levels higher than prevail now, but democracies became more stable and support for democracy was high. Then came the commodity boom from 2002 to roughly 2014, depending on the country, and the pink wave, and poverty, as was mentioned this morning, declined radically. Human development improved and inequality declined, albeit slowly. There were a few populist leaders emerging, but overall democracy remained stable and support for democracy high. However, from roughly 2014 on, economic stagnation or decline set in, and progress in social conditions stagnated and in some cases was reversed. And this led to widespread deprivation and deterioration of democracy. Here is a visual on the overall development of poverty and extreme poverty, which are good indicators of human development. This is average for all of Latin America and the Caribbean. We can see how dramatic the decline was from 1990 on, but particularly between 2002 and 2014, and how the levels rose slowly again and remained above the low of 2014. And here we see the development of inequality broken down by country. These changes are not nearly as dramatic as the Gini index moves very slowly. The Gini index is a measure of income inequality that varies from 0 to 1, with higher levels indicating higher inequality. Still, we see a general pattern of a decrease between 2002 and 2014, and then stagnation for Latin America as a whole, as well as in the important countries of Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Mexico, Peru, and Uruguay. All right, so what about relative deprivation? The concept has a long history, and it is defined as the discrepancy that one perceives between what one has and what one could or should have. It is a psychological state, and absolute deprivation may or may not result in relative deprivation, depending on people's comparisons with reference groups or previous experiences. I have listed here the key scholarly works that have coined the concept. Ted Gurr made the concept a key explanatory factor in his theory of rebellions. He argued that the experience of deterioration of people's situation after a period of improvements, and thus a discrepancy between expectations and experienced conditions, is what causes people to rebel. Well, in democracies, relative deprivation rarely takes the form of organized violent rebellion or revolution, though, as we have seen, spontaneous violence can happen, or episodic violence may be employed by protest movements as well. But the dominant form of expression of relative deprivation or discontent in democracies happens at the ballot box, by voting against incumbents. This sentiment is well captured by the slogan, "Que se vayan todos," may they all go, which became very popular in Argentina, for instance. And the result is precisely the decline of established parties and the fragmentation of party systems. Let me just provide a piece of evidence to establish the link between experienced or perceived economic deterioration and trust in democratic institutions. In this case here, the executive and the legislature. This graph is from the Americas Barometer in 2023, a Latin American average, and we can see that trust in the legislature is overall low. But those who feel that the economic situation of the country has deteriorated over the past 12 months show less than half the level of trust in the legislature of those who feel that the situation has improved, 24% compared to 49%. The difference in trust in the executive is even more pronounced. It falls from 71% to 23%. And the legislature, of course, is elected on the basis of parties. So low support for the legislature is reflected in low support for political parties. Thus, economic conditions clearly translate into trust in democratic institutions, and the decline in trust endangers support for democracy. So, what has happened to political parties as key players in democratic institutions in Latin America? Parties that presided over the debt crisis and structural adjustment were generally decimated at the polls in the next elections. The pink tide after 2000 generally brought to power parties that had been in opposition to structural adjustment or new parties. The improvements in the economic conditions and in social policy let many of them win re-election. However, from 2014 on, the deterioration in economic conditions and the experience of relative deprivation led to a significant decline in confidence in parties and other democratic institutions, and to the further decline of established parties. Now, what are the long-run consequences of the decline of established parties? Well, inexperienced politicians rise to power, and governing becomes more difficult because the presence of a multitude of old and new parties makes it more difficult to form majority coalitions. The lack of stable majority coalitions, in turn, makes the implementation of long-range policy packages more difficult, and this means that societal problems remain unaddressed. Government is not able to correct or compensate for the highly skewed distribution of economic resources and power, and the outcome is a self-reinforcing negative cycle of failure to solve societal problems and further decline of support for democracy. Now, what happens to weakened democracies or to democracies with weakened parties? Voters who lack trust in parties and other democratic institutions become susceptible to populist appeals, and they may elect populist leaders. In the worst case, populist leaders can undermine democracy from above, as they have done in Venezuela and Nicaragua. In other cases, populist leaders may be succeeded by leaders who respect democratic institutions, as happened in Ecuador. But if deficiencies in representation persist, democratic stability remains endangered. Leaders and parties that promote different conceptions of democracy, a plebiscitarian conception emphasizing popular inclusion on the one hand, versus a more representative conception emphasizing horizontal accountability on the other hand, may alternate in power, which leads to a process that Dan Slater has called careening between different institutional forms and policy orientations. Think of Argentina. And thus, again, a decreasing capacity to solve societal problems and strengthen democracy. Thank you.
Evelyn, now we'll have James's remarks.
Well, thanks, Clark, for organizing this panel, and thank you to Kellogg and Notre Dame for inviting me and allowing me to share my thoughts. So I wish to speak about state-building development and democratic performance, and I'm going to focus my comments on Africa. And I have just two observations to make, a warning, and then perhaps a piece of good news, although I know we all don't want to uncork the champagne just yet. And Clark has full-on heartburn about the state of democracy at this point, which he's shared with all of us in the breaks. So hopefully there's potentially some good news. I don't like to necessarily talk about democracy. I like to talk about what I call democratic performance. And democratic performance to me is sort of a way to think about variation in the quality of democracy, which is another way to frame, okay, is democracy getting better or worse? Is there a crisis? Is there backsliding? But I think really what I wish to suggest with democratic performance is it's really about the quality of democracy and not the quality of the institutions, but whether or not democracy is delivering what citizens essentially want from democracy. By that I mean two things. One, does democracy allow citizens to convey mandates to their leaders and then hold those leaders accountable for the policies that they pursue? And second, does it constrain leaders from the worst impulses in terms of trying to get around the fact that voters are conveying mandates and trying to hold them accountable? There has been a lot of discussion at the conference about measures of democracy, and I certainly do not want to weigh into that debate between VDEM and everybody else, although I wish to say that one thing that I think if you look at VDEM, if you look at Polity, if you look at Freedom House, one of the things that they tell us is that just looking about whether or not a country has elections isn't really going to tell you a lot about the quality of democratic governance in that country. And what I wish to highlight, at least for Africa, but I think it's generally true, is elections really are the only game in town now since the third wave. It's very rare that we're sort of thinking about alternative regime types to electoral democracy. And even though there have been coups of late in Africa, they've been promissory coups saying that they will return to a civilian government with democratic elections. And I know that it's too early to tell whether that will be true. But it does seem sort of as a global thing that elections really are the only game in town, but that doesn't tell us a lot about how democracy is performing in any one country. And so therefore, I suggest that thinking about democratic performance is maybe a way to get around sort of what's going on between these debates with various measures, to which I have very little to add, other than to say, what do we know about how well democracy is performing? The other thing I would add is, if we're trying to assess things like backsliding or progress, those are dynamic things, and our measures are actually static. And so it's very hard at any one moment in time to know what's actually happening in terms of a dynamic. So an example I use with my students a lot is, you could look at January 6th as the Capitol insurrection as a real crisis moment for democracy, because the loser to that election was trying to violently essentially call a mob to overturn that election and then stop the constitutional procedure by which that election had already more or less been decided but had to be certified by the legislative branch. Or you could look at that as a very strong test of democracy, because it didn't work. So a lot of times it's like kicking the tires on a car. You don't know which tire is necessarily deflated until you kick it. And so sometimes you need to stress test certain institutions to understand how strong they are. And so is the United States clearly a very strong democracy because it survived that attempt to undermine the constitutional procedure by which elections are certified? Or is the United States a democracy that has become weaker or is becoming weak because there was a candidate who tried to violently overthrow a constitutional procedure? So I think in the moment, when things are dynamic, it's very, very hard to say, okay, this is definitely how we're sliding along a scale of democratic, about whether a country is democracy. So I would argue that democratic performance is really a function of two things: vertical and horizontal accountability. By vertical, sort of the relationship between voters and leaders, and then horizontal accountability, that elected leaders, primarily the executive and the legislative branches, are accountable to other institutions and institutional constraints and guardrails, things like the judiciary, electoral commissions, and all the rest of it. And I would simply just say that when a country improves vertical and horizontal accountability, its democratic performance is doing better. But if there's a weakness in either or both horizontal or vertical accountability, then that would erode it. All right, so it's like Tolstoy's happy families, right? And where there's variation in democratic performance, we have unhappy families that are perhaps unhappy for their own individual reasons. Observation one. I think voters are mostly doing their part. I don't think the energy around being stressed about the future of democracy should be placed at the feet of voters, or primarily voters, or at least in Africa. Despite the fact that Africa is a region that has massive levels of inequality, I think mass politics are fairly healthy. Turnout is strong. Support for democracy on the Afrobarometer, I know there's some debate about whether it's been declining of late, and I recognize that that's true, but citizens still, for the most part, say they do prefer democratic regimes. And I think the important thing to remember is that one of the things that voters are doing is they're trying to use their access in electoral politics, not necessarily to fight inequality in Africa, but rather to provide for development. And so I think I agree with Michael, I agree with Clark and others that linkage between democracy and development is really, really important. They're not primarily using elections to support anti-institutionalists. Yes, there have been populist campaigns of late. I think we could read William Ruto's campaign in Kenya is populist. Certainly what's going on right now in South Africa, there's a lot of populism that may pull the ANC down from a majority and sort of explain what's going on with the EFF and with Jacob Zuma still being in the political limelight. But even so, I don't think these are necessarily anti-institutionalist parties like the modern Republican Party in the United States. And I think voters really are trying to use access in the ballot and to electoral institutions to hold their leaders accountable to providing for development. I'm less concerned that inequality overall is going to be a prime motivating factor, and let me just suggest a few reasons. One is that folks are not very good at saying where they are on the income distribution. Two, it's not clear to me that the counterfactual that matters for people in thinking about their livelihoods is themselves relative to the distribution of livelihoods in their society overall. Rather, I think it could be the counterfactual, or the standard that they're thinking about could be where they think they should be regardless of where others are. maybe where their parents were or where they thought they would be at their parents' age, or thinking about where they want their children to be when their children are their age. And it could just be overall absolute levels of a lack of development that matters. And so it's not about it being relative, but just its absolute levels. I think these are all empirical questions. I'm not saying inequality doesn't matter, but I'm saying it may not matter exactly in the way that we think, and that overall absolute living standard might be something to think about. And I think as well, thinking about now linking this to state building, I think one of the challenges for African governments has been to raise absolute living standards, particularly since the third wave. However, I think, and I know there's a lot of variation and there's exceptions to what I'm about to say, but since about 2000, things really have improved economically in Africa. And living standards have risen, particularly in things like education and healthcare. Income, for the most part, or average income, has risen as well. And the question to me is not sort of whether or not that's enough for voters to continue to participate, or whether that would change how voters are participating, but just rather whether governments are actually active enough in trying to provide for those, raising those absolute living standards. One kind of exception to what I'm saying is I'm currently involved in some research that looks at the relationship between food insecurity and support for democracy, and where folks respond that they are food insecure, they're actually less likely to support democratic regimes. And so I think African governments are going to have to be focused on living standards, income, and the rest of it. Regardless of levels of inequality, they're going to have to be, I think, trying to target those folks at the bottom and raising them up, regardless of what happens in the middle or at the top. So I think that's probably why, or one explanation for why voters continue to turn out and support democracy in large numbers. Second observation is then, why is democratic performance, why does it vary? What is the crisis for democracy in Africa, if there is one? Well, I think it is probably true that what I've described thus far is only a stable equilibrium insofar as African governments are responding to voter pressure. But if they're not, I would suggest it's not due to a lack of concern on the part of voters, or even perhaps due to the inability of governments to enact policies that raise absolute living standards, but rather it's a lack of horizontal accountability. It's that there aren't yet enough institutions to prevent executive aggrandizement, to sort of bolster the power of the legislature, to restrain what the executive is able to do. And so therefore, where democracy seems to be in crisis to me is much more at the institutional horizontal level than at the voter vertical level. And that's why we see things like the continuation of campaign violence, electoral fraud, a lack of competent electoral management bodies that are able to constrain, and basically run free and fair elections. And so I think that's kind of the bad news. Let me just give you one little bit of hope, and this is what I'll end on. So some good news. And I think this is something that my discipline of political science has really not paid enough attention to. Most of us study the elected branches of government, and then we forget about the third branch, which is the judiciary. And particularly in Africa, we haven't studied judiciaries or judicial politics because even after the third wave, there was a lot of sort of, judges are just patronage appointments for the executive. They don't really balance in any kind of constitutional sense. They're not able to constrain what government action is, or they're just working at the behest of powerful political actors. But I think that's changing. And I think Kenya is a model of how that's changing, because I think we're seeing constitutional reform and we're seeing robust judicial reform in ways that the judiciary may be one of the last hopes of imposing horizontal accountability. So, Kenya has problematic elections every election. After its 2010 constitution sort of clarified exactly who runs the elections, well, that didn't help the people who run the elections run them better. But what it also did is it clarified how any electoral disputes have to be adjudicated. And that is now by the Supreme Court, that has the ability to exert its constitutional authority to, in effect, decide outcome determinative election disputes. So they did that in 2013, and in 2017, and in 2022. And what we've seen is that even though the elections are still a problem and fraud is still, rampant, the fact that there is this institutional check is helping to sort of guarantee that elections might actually stick around. And so I think one of the things that we should focus on moving forward is thinking about horizontal accountability. And it's not just the things that we've thought about before with legislatures and electoral management bodies. I really want to stress the importance that I think judiciaries and the judicial branch of government and judicial reform can actually assist with this. And so if there's any good news, that would be the good news, I would say. Thank you.
Great, thanks, James. I want to let the audience know that I never used this sign. That's how great this panel is. Not in a single case did they go over the time that I had. Fantastic. Now, not that the topic of development and democracy is broad or anything, and it would take 57 panels probably, but this panel showed the variety, obviously. So we have, can there be policies to help nascent or weak or democratic institutions last or stay, from Michael. Helena talked about that space, the civil society space, which, boy, that goes back to like the 60s and 70s discussions of democracy. And of course they're important. We heard earlier in the conference about the great in a sad way, the strategies of government suing suing private and NGO bodies out of existence. So you're suing them out of the democratic space. And then Evelyne brings us back to political parties are important. Well, that's clearly the case in many, if not most countries, including the North as well as the South. So, you know, the Trump win could not have come without the Republican Party having its own internal problems and not being unified. That had to happen for his populist candidacy, well, more or less populist candidacy to win. And then James moving us into even another direction of judiciary, which as an Africanist, I never think about. Shame on me. And yet, in the day-to-day lives of people whose property might be threatened by the government, who's the brother of the president wants your company, those are the frontline people of having a constitutional order that works for them. It's not just the act of voting, as James is telling us. It's about what happens down the street in the courthouse if you get beat up by the police or your property taken. So the floor is open, and unfortunately the topics are so open that we'll never get finished. But we have about 15 to 20 minutes before lunch, and we'll proceed from there. Sir? Actually, do you decide? Are you the authority now?
I don't
The
think so.
authoritarian leader? Okay. I think you guys should be. The people with the microphone should be the dictators.
So I have a provocative question for Evelyne Huber, which is to make a very interesting and powerful argument about bad times and relative deprivation being really damaging to democracy. But of course, it was during the good times that left-wingers like Hugo Chavez really destroyed democracy in Venezuela, and that left-winger like Daniel Ortega really destroyed democracy in Nicaragua, and that left-winger Correa in Ecuador really did a lot of damage to democracy. And Evo Morales, during the height of the commodities boom, wanted to be re-elected. And so it seems to be that left-wingers during good times are at least as dangerous as right-wingers during bad times, because when you look at the last 35 years, who has really destroyed democracy in Latin America from the right? It's Fujimori and it's Bukele. And so you have, in some sense, more left-wingers during good times destroying democracy than right-wingers during bad times.
Well, so first of all, Chavez, of course, came to power in the wake of the serious economic crisis in Venezuela, which destroyed the previous parties. So, you know, again, he came in to avoid, and he arguably, he was elected on the basis of relative deprivation of the of the Venezuelan population. And Nicaragua similarly. In other words, Nicaragua suffered greatly from the aftermath of the war, and so we cannot say that Nicaragua had that. Not every country followed the same pattern with the boom and so on and so forth. Ecuador, well, but the democracy survived in Ecuador. In other words, I wouldn't say that democracy after Korea was worse than before. In other words, before Korea, you had lots of turnover of governments and unconstitutional turnovers of governments, and so I would argue with that.
Michael, do you want to speak, or Helena? Or in the Africa response to that? In its entirety? Okay.
There's a lot of questions.
There are. We'll go, sir, in the back.
Thank you so much to the panel. My name is Faisal. I'm a research associate at Kellogg, but I'm also a human rights advocate from Venezuelan civil society. I'm Venezuelan. So, of course, the ideal scenario is to support governments that are willing to advance in authentic development and democratic progress, but in most of the places that this support is needed, that's not the case. So that leaves civil society actors and organizations as the last standing bastion of democratic promotion. But we are also facing a global crisis in terms of international cooperation that supports this work. So that's one of my concerns, and I would like to hear some thoughts of how can we together navigate this issue. And secondly, how can we make these more scarce opportunities more democratic, more fair, more accessible to local and grassroots organizations that in the end are the ones that are delivering this work, are promoting the democratic change and the improvement that is needed. What we are seeing today actually is that this is the selection of the most traditional international implementing organizations for this kind of projects. And in the end, the local organizations are even getting 20 or less % of the total amount awarded for these projects. And I think that's something that we have to also work on. And the local organizations are currently facing more threats to their existence. More elevated tax and government fees, more audits, even other strategies to diminish them that in the end is posing on the organizations a duty to invest in security, in mitigation measures. Just as an example, yesterday Venezuelan National Assembly was discussing in a second discussion the bill to regulate NGOs that is including all these threats. So in the end, what we are seeing in civil society in the different countries that we are working on a dynamic that has become extractivist, and is not maybe helping organizations to develop all the work with their own complete capacity, and is forcing them to even face scenarios of technical shutdowns because they are not willing to work under these conditions with the kind of support that are getting. So my question is what can you do? What can we do together to navigate this and support more these local organizations that are finally the space in which democracy can flourish in this adverse context? Thank you so much.
That's a great question. We actually had two questions. The first one was how do you get international forces, people, organizations, countries together on the kind of the same page, I thought. And then there was the local question. The first is, it kind of goes back to the first panel, which is, we really haven't talked about the history of either trying to help democracies or not help democracies. And of course, the elephant in the room is China, because there was a dominance of the US, the World Bank, that whole Washington consensus that had structural adjustment programs that tried to reward good behaviors. And then China got rich. And they don't really care if you're imprisoning your opposition. I mean, they don't really care. I'm not actually indicting China. That's not part of their foreign policy. They believe in other kinds of foreign policy. So now the edge or the whip or the branch or the positive and negative inducements of those who want more democratic regimes is weaker. So the answer, I'm going to answer the first one. There is no international consensus on supporting any kind of regime out there. There's a fight about it, basically. Russia and China and US and Western Europe, they do not agree on what kind of government should be supported. Okay, we can go full stop there, sorry. But on helping the local, this is a panel that can help answer some of that. So how do we, the question is like, how do we help the local? How do we help local organizations? Or
How can we make the opportunities for international support more accessible, more fair, and that recognizes the real needs on the ground about like all the threats that local organizations are facing in these countries?
okay, okay, sure.
I'll start quickly, and I'm sure Helena will have more to say. So, very much embrace the spirit of the question. Helena spoke about decolonizing democracy. We speak at USAID about decolonizing foreign assistance, and enhancing direct support to local organizations is a critical piece of that. And so we've set some pretty ambitious, actually numerical targets. They're not going to sound ambitious, but by the baseline of what we're coming from, they are quite ambitious. To have 25% of USAID funding going directly to local organizations, and 50% of our funding, being fully kind of inclusive of local voices and perspectives, and driving, what those programs actually look like. And that requires rewiring the way we work in all sorts of ways. Things as simple as publishing solicitations in local languages, to trying to make the many layers of red tape and all the lawyers and accountants and strictures that come with operating with a U.S. government institution and taking our money, making that a little bit easier to navigate for a small, nimble, locally based community organization in many of the places where we work. I'll just say, looping back to the first part of the question, this is challenging, particularly, I would say, in the democracy and rights space, by the tendency of kind of a copycat effect around things like foreign agent laws. I mean, you mentioned PRC, but the Russian kind of example here, I think, is very, very evident. Most recently, what we're seeing in Georgia. So even as we try to sort of do as much as possible to be as directly involved and supportive of local organizations doing this critical work, we also need to be conscious of the do no harm principle, and looking at finding ways, in some cases, to work within or around restrictive laws that are set up precisely to crush that local civil society. So it's challenging, but Helena has all the answers.
Yeah, she is a policymaker after all.
Thank you. So, there is nothing that can be more important than institutions like USAID embracing the fight to localize support and resources because of the amount of resources that they manage. Foundations like the one that I work with, even though we have a lot of money, it is not comparable to those amounts of money. And in reality, there are things that you can see and others that you cannot see when you look at our data. Because we are facing a lot of challenges to getting funding into places that are really problematic. Like, for example, Venezuela. You know that the laws are absolutely restrictive, and that sometimes the sheer association with an American foundation is putting a target sign on activists. So a lot of our funding that is locally oriented, unfortunately, goes through other funding mechanisms where it is less evident for the purposes of how these funds work, of where the funds are going. So for example, we use a lot of intermediaries that work in regions to make sure that we get small, accessible, quick funding out into the regions. And that applies particularly for funding that is related to emergency situations, protections, and issues like that. So you will never get a complete picture of how much goes into the particularly challenging places because there are so many roadblocks that actually make it important to find other ways to support the movements that are still resisting on the ground. More has to be done, always. It is not enough. We have subscribed the localization challenge in terms of wanting to see how much of our resources goes directly into the global south, and we want to push beyond 50% of the international programs at least, and I think we're absolutely there, but we will not reach 80%, and that is related to these intermediaries that we have to use.
That's well answered. Madame, way in the back. Yes.
I actually just wanted to touch on that point briefly. So I work at Freedom House. We are one of the organizations that are sucking all the money away from local actors because we take a cut when it comes through. It's, you know, I get it. They got to pay my salary before it goes down, right? So, but one of the things that I think is really critical for this conversation is for actors like USAID and the Ford Foundation to figure out ways to reduce the administrative burden to administering these grants, because what we have found is that we're trying to comply with USAID's sort of ethos of 50% of funding going directly to local partners as well. And one of the biggest challenges that we have in that is in order for us to provide 50% of those funds to local partners, we need to turn local partners into Western NGOs. They've got to have chief financial officers, and they've got to grow from something that was an organic grassroots social movement into an industry, a business, that is then fully reliant on foreign aid. So I wonder if you can speak to your kind of philosophy around sort of creating social movements that are reliant on foreign funding by this mechanism of trying to pump more money into directly to local actors.
I'm not sure that I would frame it exactly that way, but and maybe this is a weedy conversation to have over coffee rather than with our 80 friends here. But I think I would just say, like, everything you're saying is real. It is, we hear it from everybody, right, about how challenging it is to work with us. I think there's also recognition with things like the Power for the People, Power by the People initiative of, like, you know, the importance of supporting social movements along and not kind of NGO-ifying everything, right, in terms of the kinds of democratic processes at the grassroots that you know we want to support and that we see real energy in, and so marrying that that strategic objective to the reality of, like, how USAID has been set up to work and requires others to work with us is really challenging in practice. And so, but what I would want you to take away is, like, the conviction behind finding ways to do that is real. The practical challenges are enormous, and so, like, that's, I think, a good setup for a dialogue about, you know, specific ideas for how we can, you know, make these things easier.
I think the word conviction is important here. Most of all of you are experienced in this, so a government who's interested in supporting something in another country locally has its own laws to follow, and you have to be really afraid of supporting any movement that might be a bad movement or turn into a bad movement. It's hard to determine friendlies from not friendlies, or who's well run or not well run. That's your own laws, and your reporting laws increase every year in this country for sure, right? Congress keeps passing laws, report on every dime you spend, and it better be to the right people, Who are the right people? Well, you have laws in those countries that say supporting NGOs is either difficult, hard, treasonous. Doing this kind of stuff is actually supremely difficult to get anything done on the ground, even if you want to. And if you do, then you're imperialist. So you have to worry about that, because you need to have enough local decision making to make it not imperialist, because you don't want to be determining all that. Very difficult. This is why conviction, like Helena and Michael, people like that, is, for me, it's like you got to get the right people in there, because the actual processes are so hard to do. To get stuff done on the ground is hard to do. Anyway, Madame.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up a little bit on that, and in relation to Elena's earlier point about sort of whiteness of the space, and just emphasize that, following up on this previous comment, that when you talk to indigenous and Afro-descendant activists in Latin America, one of the biggest complaints that they have about their relationship with international donors is the challenge that those dollars create for building sort of a cohesive movement, and that it ends up actually creating bifurcation within the indigenous and Afro-descendant movements in the region, and that this makes it more difficult, in fact, for them to have voice and power in the political process. And so my question, sort of for the donor/policy side of the panel, is following up on the previous comment about the way that donors think about their relationships to particularly minoritized communities in the global south, and how their relationships create actually potentially additional burdens or barriers for those organizations, and how to overcome them. And then just a totally different type of question, I wanted to kind of pick up on something that Wendy had mentioned in the earlier panel about the way that inequalities can differentially affect the way that inequality sort of intersects with criminality, and how poor and other minoritized groups bear the extra burden of violence. And I would add to that point that they also can bear the extra burden of enforcement, because people are willing to tolerate the violation of the rights of people from minoritized groups. So this question is sort of more for the academic side of the panel, in thinking about the intersection between inequality and criminality, and the response of the government to criminality, and the implications that that has for democracy. I'm thinking about Latin America, but I think that this also applies in Africa.
It is essential for us to work as close to the ground as we can. And it is essential for us in Latin America, for instance, to work with indigenous communities and with Afro-descendant communities, Garifunas, etc. And it is the burden of our teams to do that in the least disruptive way possible. In reality, there is no easy answer to this, because you have communities that are putting up fights with or without money. And resources can make some pieces of those fights more feasible, and can make some of the essential pieces sustainable, particularly if they involve litigation and long-term processes. In reality, what I try to do is to tell my team that it is their burden to bend backwards to make things as easy as possible for organizations and for movements. We can hardly support movements directly, because we ourselves are restrained by a series of legal frameworks to which we have to comply with. But what we can do is work with others who can do that more directly. For example, when we work with the movement of Disappeared in Mexico, we work with many different actors who work with them, including the University of Notre Dame, because we need support coming in from many different sides in order to support a movement that doesn't have the skills, the technical capacities, etc., to actually move very complicated pieces and put them together, but that has the power to keep fighting for justice and for a space in governments that don't give them the space and that deny them their agenda. So, no easy answer. super complicated for us as well to stand by what we want to see, but I believe that it is our burden to do the best.
I'll just, in the interest of time, maybe mention one very concrete thing, which is that I think we have recognized the need to diversify our own teams. Something like 70% of our teams in our country missions are actually staffed by locals, and we have, it's one of the great kind of strengths of USAID, that the caliber of people we're able to recruit and employ technical experts in the countries where we work is very, very high. I mean, we have people that go on, to be ministers and serve in all sorts of capacities. So that is a real strength, but it's also, it's demonstrated, I think, a tendency to reinforce some of the structural inequalities that exist in the societies where we're working, because we're recruiting from the best academic institutions. We're requiring fluent English. I mean, you can imagine in a place like Guatemala what that ends up looking like in terms of the kind of local staff that we're employing. And so there's an effort, again, within the kind of limitations that are imposed on us to try to kind of proactively address that. And one way we're doing that is actually with both in Colombia and Guatemala, and hopefully soon in other countries, by creating fellowship programs focused on, in Colombia, for example, Afro-Colombian and indigenous youth to come in and spend a year working with USAID. That creates a pipeline of sorts for us, but more importantly, a pipeline of talent for the country, and folks who hopefully then understand how we work and can go and return to their communities or otherwise contribute to their country and work with us and allow us to be that much more effective in addressing some of the challenges that you're mentioning.
We have to go to lunch, but an anecdote on conviction in a way. So I think we're all here in various capacities, and knowledges and experiences for very similar reasons. And in one of the first elections I ever witnessed in Africa, the line for voting, they're often long, and this one was literally 1 mile long. And that's a literal distance, because I had someone measure it for me. So a mile long. It's going to be hours. It's hot, very hot in the sun, people waiting for hours. And the soldiers were around, and they kind of came up, and they didn't like something about somebody, and it was a woman who was doing nothing, and they just beat her up. They beat her up, and it was startling and weird and amazing. And that woman got up, and she went to the back of the line and stood again. And so that's why we're here, because she wanted her say. And that's what we're all trying to help, just having people have their say. Thank you for the panel.